120 million people used to listen every week, not to a podcast, not to a streaming service, to voices that traveled thousands of miles through the air, bouncing off the sky itself, and landed in a bedroom in Ohio or Indiana or Texas, where a boy was sitting in the dark with a pair of headphones and a receiver that glowed orange and a wire running out his window to a tree. Those voices came from London and Moscow and Havana and Berlin and Tokyo and Bombay. They came every night, and now they are almost gone. This is the story of shortwave radio, and if you ever turned that dial, you already know what was lost. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. You did not find shortwave. Shortwave found you. Maybe it was a hand-me-down radio from your father, an old Zenith console with a shortwave band that nobody in the house used. Maybe it was a kit from Allied Radio for $30 that you soldered together in the basement. Maybe it was a Hallicrafters you saved up for by mowing lawns all summer. However it happened, one night you turned past the AM band and kept going, past the familiar stations, past the static, into frequencies you did not know existed, and somewhere in that static, a voice appeared. It was speaking English, but with an accent you had never heard. It said the name of a city you had only seen on a globe, and in that moment, your bedroom got bigger. Not the room, your world. The world inside the room, because you were no longer listening to your town. You were listening to the earth. The BBC World Service was the first voice most American boys found on shortwave. It boomed in every night on 6,175 kilohertz, clear, steady, British, reliable. The pips, those 5 short beeps followed by one long one at the top of the hour, became the most recognizable sound on shortwave. You heard them and you knew, this is the BBC. This is real. The news was read by men and women who sounded like they were sitting in a library in London, which they more or less were. They told you what was happening in places you could not pronounce, in conflicts you did not understand, in a tone that assumed you were intelligent enough to figure it out. That tone, calm, factual, never panicked, never loud, became the sound of the world as it actually was. Not as the American networks told you it was, not as your parents told you it was, as it was. The BBC did not care that you were 12. They talked to you like an adult. And you sat up a little straighter when they did. Radio Netherlands was different. They had a program called the Happy Station Show, one of the longest-running programs in radio history. The host played music from around the world and read letters from listeners and made you feel like you were part of a club that had no building and no membership card, but that met every week on 9,590 kilohertz. Radio Sweden played folk music that sounded like nothing you had ever heard in Indiana. Swiss Radio International had a precision that felt Swiss. Everything on time, everything in order, everything exactly where it should be. Radio Australia came through like a voice from the future because it was already tomorrow there. Each station had a personality. Each frequency had a face. You learned them the way you learned people, by their voice, their rhythm, their accent, the music they played between the news. Then you found Radio Moscow. Radio Moscow was the voice of the Soviet Union, the enemy, the country your teachers told you wanted to destroy America, the country you practiced hiding from under your desk during atomic bomb drills. And here they were in your bedroom in English at 11 o'clock at night, telling you a completely different version of the world. They told you that the Soviet Union was a paradise, that workers were happy, that America was the aggressor, that capitalism was a disease. You did not believe them. You were 12, not stupid, but you listened. Because hearing the enemy talk was the most exciting thing that had ever come through a pair of headphones. It was like intercepting a secret transmission. It was like being a SPY, except the spy was sitting in his pajamas on a twin bed in Michigan with a glass of milk on the nightstand. You found Voice of America, the United States answering back. Radio Havana Cuba, Fidel Castro's voice, 90 miles from Florida, telling the Caribbean that America was finished. Radio Berlin International, East Germany, from behind the wall. Deutsche Welle, West Germany, from the other side of the same wall. You could hear both sides of the Berlin Wall on the same radio, on the same night from the same bed. You turned the dial 10 kilohertz, and the world flipped upside down. One frequency told you the wall was a prison. The next told you the wall was protection. You were 12 years old, and you were doing geopolitics in your pajamas. And then there were the number stations. You found them by accident. You were scanning through the frequencies late at night, and you landed on a signal that was different from everything else. No music, no news, no announcer, just a voice, usually a woman, sometimes a man, sometimes a child reading numbers, 5-digit groups repeated over and over, in English, in Spanish, in German, in Russian, in languages you could not identify. The voice was flat, emotionless, mechanical. 57392, pause. 84160, pause. 57392, again. The same groups, the same order, for 10 minutes, then silence. Then a different set of numbers. You did not know what they were. Nobody told you. No book in the library explained them. No teacher knew. Years later, you learned that they were coded messages sent by intelligence agencies to spies in the field. The CIA, the KGB, MI6, the Mossad. You were 12 years old, lying in bed, and you had accidentally intercepted a communication between a government and its spy. That is what shortwave radio gave you. Not just the news, not just the music, the secret traffic of the Cold War floating through your bedroom at the speed of light. The QSL cards were proof that it was real. When you heard a distant station, really heard it, not just caught a fragment in the static, you wrote a reception report. Date, time, frequency, what you heard, the name of the program, the quality of the signal. You wrote it carefully in your best handwriting because this letter was going to another country and you wanted them to take you seriously even though you were 12. You folded the report into an envelope, looked up the station's address in the World Radio TV Handbook, a thick book that listed every broadcasting station on Earth, organized by country, with frequencies and schedules and mailing addresses, and you wrote the address on the envelope. Radio Moscow, Moscow, USSR, BBC External Services, Bush House, London, England, All India Radio, New Delhi, India. You put a stamp on it, you walked to the mailbox, and you sent a letter across the ocean because you had heard a voice in the dark and you wanted proof. Weeks later, sometimes months later, sometimes so many months that you forgot you had written, an envelope arrived at your house. It had a foreign stamp, a return address in Cyrillic or Arabic, or a script you could not read. Your mother put it on the kitchen table and said a letter came for you from. She squinted at the stamp. Germany, or India, or Japan. You opened it and inside was a card, a QSL card, the size of a postcard, colorful. Some of them were the most beautiful printed things you had ever held. The station's logo in bright colors, a picture of the country, the Kremlin, the Taj Mahal, the Brandenburg Gate, and on the back, a confirmation. Yes, on that date, at that time, on that frequency, they were broadcasting and you heard them from your bedroom, through a wire on a tree, 4,000 miles away, and they were thanking you for listening. You collected them. You pinned them to your bedroom wall in rows, organized by continent. You had Europe covered, BBC, Radio Netherlands, Deutsche Welle, Radio Sweden, Swiss Radio International. You had South America, Radio Nacional Brasilia, HCJB Ecuador, Radio Havana. You were working on Africa. You needed Radio Ghana. You needed FRCN Lagos. You needed Radio RSA from Johannesburg. Each card was proof that the world was real and that you had touched it from a room, in a house, on a street, in a town that most of those countries had never heard of. Your friends collected baseball cards. You collected countries. And every card on your wall was a place you had been to without leaving your bed. And then there was the postman. A boy in 1963, 13 years old, had been sending reception reports to Radio Moscow. Every month, a large envelope would arrive from the Soviet Union with a QSL card, a program schedule, sometimes a small gift, a pin, a calendar, a booklet about Soviet agriculture. The postman noticed. In 1963, during the Cold War, a postman in America noticed that a house on his route was receiving regular mail from the USSR, he told the boy's father. He said he was obligated to report mail from communist countries to the government. The father talked to the boy. The boy stopped writing to Radio Moscow. A 13-year-old's hobby was reported as a potential security concern because he listened to a radio station. That is how powerful shortwave was, and how afraid people were of what it carried. The equipment was part of the ritual. You started with whatever you could afford, maybe a Hallicrafter's S-38 for under $50. The receiver that introduced more boys to shortwave than any other single piece of equipment ever made. It was not pretty, it was not precise, the dial was cramped, and the selectivity was poor, and it drifted off frequency when the tubes warmed up. But it worked, and the first time you heard the BBC come through those headphones on an S-38, you understood why people spent their lives chasing signals across the ionosphere. If you were lucky, you graduated to a Hallicrafter's SX-110, or a Lafayette HE-30, or a Heathkit GR-64 that you built yourself over a weekend, following a manual that weighed more than the receiver. If you dreamed big, you dreamed of a Drake R4B or a Hammerland HQ-170, receivers that cost $300 or $400 and had dials so smooth they felt like they were turning through butter. And if you dreamed impossible, you dreamed of Collins, the Collins KWM-2, the Rolls-Royce, the instrument that NASA used for the Apollo program. You never owned one. You knew a man at the radio club who owned one, and you sat in his shack and listened to it once, and the clarity was so perfect it sounded like the broadcaster was sitting in the next room. You went home and turned on your S-38, and the static sounded louder than it had before. The dial glowed orange in the dark. The tubes hummed behind the metal chassis. The tuning knob was heavy and smooth, and turned with the precision of a safe dial. You learned to tune slowly. A fraction of a millimeter on the knob was the difference between a clear signal and static. You developed a feel for it, a fingertip sensitivity that you used nowhere else in your life except on that knob, in that dark room, at that hour of the night. Your fingers knew where the BBC was. Your fingers knew where Radio Moscow started. Your fingers could find Radio Havana in the dark without opening your eyes. That dial was a map of the world, and your fingertip was the compass. The antenna was everything. The longer the wire, the more you heard. You started with 20 feet strung to the gutter, then 40 feet to the fence, then 70 feet to the tree at the back of the yard. Some boys ran 100 feet of wire, zigzagging from the house to the garage, to the clothesline pole, to the elm tree and back. The antenna was invisible during the day, a thin copper line that nobody noticed. At night, it was a net that caught signals from across the planet and fed them down the wire, through the window, into the receiver and into your ears. 120 million people listened to shortwave every week at its peak. That was the BBC's estimate for global shortwave listenership. 120 million people in every country on Earth, turning a dial and finding a voice from somewhere far away. It was the internet before the internet. It was global communication in real time, available to anyone with a receiver and a wire. It was how the world talked to itself. And then the world stopped talking. The BBC World Service ended shortwave broadcasts to North America and Europe in 2012. Radio Netherlands shut down its shortwave service entirely the same year. Voice of America drastically reduced its shortwave output. Deutsche Welle pulled back. Radio Moscow became Radio Russia and barely whispered where it once shouted. Radio Havana Cuba still transmits, but to a fraction of its former schedule. One by one, the voices that had filled the shortwave bands every night, the voices that a boy in Ohio heard while lying in bed with headphones and a wire out the window, went silent. Internet killed shortwave the same way television killed radio, not by being better at the same thing, but by making the same thing unnecessary. Why tune a dial and strain to hear a crackling signal from London when you can open a browser and read the BBC in high definition? Why wait for Radio Moscow's English service at 11 p.m. when you can read Russian news at any hour? Why send a reception report and wait 3 months for a QSL card when you can email a station and get a reply in 3 minutes? The answer is obvious. The browser is better, the streaming is clearer, the information is faster, and none of it, not 1 second of it, feels the way shortwave felt. Because shortwave was not about information. Information was the excuse. The real thing, the thing you cannot get from a browser or a podcast or a streaming service, was discovery. Shortwave was about turning a dial and not knowing what you would find. It was about hearing a voice you did not expect, from a country you had never thought about, playing music you had never heard, in a language you could not understand but that sounded beautiful anyway. It was about the static between the stations, the hiss and the crackle and the fade that meant you were listening to a signal that had bounced off the ionosphere and traveled 4,000 miles to reach your ear. That static was not interference. That static was the sound of distance, the sound of the Earth being large, the sound of a signal fighting its way through space to get to you. And when a voice came through that static, clear for 10 seconds, then fading, then surging back, it felt like a gift, not a download, not a stream, a gift from the sky. Nobody surfs the internet at midnight and feels that. Nobody opens a browser and holds their breath. Nobody clicks a link and feels the hair stand up on their arms because a voice from the other side of the world just appeared where silence used to be. That feeling died when the transmitters went off, and no amount of bandwidth will ever bring it back. You remember the dial, you remember the glow, you remember the weight of the headphones on your ears and the feel of the tuning knob under your fingertip, and the moment, the exact moment, when a voice appeared in the static and said the name of a city on the other side of the world. You were 12. You were alone. The house was dark, and the whole planet was in your ear. The frequencies are still there. The bands are still there. The ionosphere still bounces radio signals around the curve of the Earth the way it did in 1965. The physics has not changed, but the voices are gone. The transmitters are off. The studios are empty. And the boy who sat in the dark and heard the world is sitting here now, remembering what it sounded like when 120 million people were listening, and the whole world was talking, and all you needed to hear it was a receiver and a wire and a night that was quiet enough.